Well, good afternoon, Attorney General Holder, and to everybody who is watching this. I'm going to try to jump right into our conversation today, which is with the 82nd Attorney General for the United States of America, Mr. Eric Holder here. And we're going to talk today about the future of our democracy. And I think it's a great time to have that conversation because we're at a bit of an inflection point, an important moment for our democracy, I think. So welcome, and let's get started. I think, despite the fact that the focus of this conversation is going to be on the future, it would help everyone, I think, to set the stage a little bit and talk about the current state of affairs, what our democracy looks like right now. And we're coming out of, now it's a little over a year ago, but we're coming out of a pretty important election, a presidential election year that was really unlike certainly any other in my lifetime, but maybe any other ever. And we faced, a pandemic. We faced a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and frankly, we were having this election in the middle of a big debate over voting rights and over our democracy and what it looks like. And so I'm wondering if you could start us off by giving us your assessment of how we handled that moment as a nation, as a democracy. How well did it function during the 2020 elections?
Well, I don't want to start off, Sean, by being, particularly alarmist, but I think our democracy is at a crossroads. We are going to have to decide as a nation what path do we want to take. And I think you have to kind of pull back. If you look at what happened in November of 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, we conducted a totally fair election that involved more American citizens voting than ever before. And since that time, lies have been told. Attempts have been made to somehow portray what happened back in November 2020 as a steal, when in fact it was anything but that. And how we respond to that notion of the big steal and what's going on in our state legislatures around the country, where attempts are being made to suppress the vote, to affect who's even going to be able to count the vote. How we respond to that will determine the path of our democracy going forward. And as I said, I don't want to be, alarmist or hyperbolic, but I really do think that our democracy is at risk in a way that it never has been before, or not since the Civil War. And that's a pretty bold statement to make, but I think it's actually one that is substantiated by the facts that we're confronting.
I think we're those of us who work in this space talking about democracy and voting rights all the time are sort of, I agree, caught in this moment where we don't want to sound the alarm in a way that is going to sort of undermine people's faith in our democracy, because as you said, we really proved how resilient and strong our democracy is in 2020 in the face of all of that. We had, the most secure election in our nation's history, according to the Department of Homeland Security, and one with record turnout at the same time. And but at the same time, we need to sound the alarm about these attacks that you referenced. And it's a balance we have to strike about what we need to do better without suggesting that somehow it's broken in the first place. And so you talked about these attacks, and as you know, at the Brennan Center, we track all of the voting rights legislation across the country, and we saw something in 2021 that we've really never seen before. We saw 19 states pass 34 restrictive laws restricting voting access, and that represents, we've now for about a decade seen this mounting set of attempts to suppress the vote and restrict access, but that was one out of every 3 laws passed since we started tracking laws in 2011 were passed in 2021, and it wasn't just those laws. There's the way that maps are being drawn right now. In redistricting, there are attacks on election officials, threats to election officials, and so many other things that we saw last year that really show the way that there are folks who are set on attacking the system that we have now and claiming that something's wrong with it. And given that we just had this successful election, given that it was the most secure, what do you think is motivating this attack that we're seeing? Because what you hear from the people who are passing these restrictive laws is that there's a problem with election integrity, there's a problem with fraud, and I hope that most of the people watching this know and have heard that there's zero evidence for any of that. So I'm curious what you think it is that is motivating the attacks that we are currently seeing on our democracy.
This is all about power. I mean, it's plain and simple. It's all about the acquisition and the retention of power. Those anti-democratic forces in the country now see power potentially slipping away from them because of demographic changes in the nation, because of ideological shifts in the nation. And one party has made the determination that it is in their political interest to hold on to power and to do so by getting behind these anti-democratic efforts. I mean, it's a sad thing. It's also a frightening thing to think that one of our two major parties can stand behind the notion of making it more difficult for American citizens to vote by really engaging in partisan and racial gerrymandering, the likes of which we have not seen before, and by actually subverting the infrastructure of our electoral system, by attacking people, Republicans as well as Democrats, people who are simply volunteering their time, or they are low-level elected officials who really just want to get the counting right. And they want to take from those kind of nonpartisan, neutral people, take that responsibility and put it in the hands of interested state legislatures, for instance. So this is, these are the mechanisms, and the why, I think, is all about, as I said, the retention of power. And the concern that I have there is that at least one party seems to be okay with what could grow into a political apartheid system where you have minority rule. The majority of the people in this country could cast ballots for candidates, for policies that are inconsistent with what the party in power wants to do, or they'd like to see themselves in power. And we might not have a system that would allow for the will of the people to actually be expressed in a way that their representatives actually end up serving in state legislatures as well as in the federal legislature.
And so you touched on a couple things that maybe make this moment different than the past, but I want to ask you a little bit more about that. There is, sadly, the idea of putting up obstacles to voting and making it harder for certain segments of the population to vote is nothing new in this country. It's something that has been, the story of our democracy, frankly, for a very long time. Neither is it anything new for those efforts to be targeted at voters of color. And so I'm wondering, for you, what is it about this moment that is the same as what we've seen in the past? And what is it about this moment and the kinds of attacks that we're seeing that make this feel different to you?
Yeah, I mean, the way it strikes me as different is that we have the infrastructure of one party that has glommed on to the notion of the big lie, the notion that our electoral system is somehow, rife with fraud, casting doubt on, the efficacy, the neutrality of the electoral system. I'm not sure that we've ever seen that before, and to the extent that we have seen, attempts to subvert the vote, we've not seen it necessarily at the highest levels within a particular party. And now we have the leaders, a former president, people who are, in control of the party on the federal level, the highest levels at the state level as well. You see them all buying into this notion that it's good for them to suppress the vote. It's good for them to do gerrymandering. It's good for them to fool around with our electoral infrastructure. And that, the depths, the extent to which we see that permeating one of our two major political parties is not something that I think we have seen before. And, previous attempts to do these kinds of things were, maybe understood by people in Washington at high levels in, one party or the other. But at least they made a show of saying these are things like that are not things that we're doing. It's inconsistent with who we are. Now there's no hiding it. People are saying at the highest levels, hey, yeah, there is fraud. The election was stolen. That's why we need to have these anti-democratic measures put into place. And that, I think, strikes me as fundamentally different from that which we've experienced before.
Yeah, the people who are at the sort of highest levels of this game, and this are saying that the rules to the game are rigged and that the game doesn't work, despite being the people who are sort of at the very top of that. I do think it's interesting how the folks at the highest levels of power are suggesting that the system that they are at the top of has somehow is broken. That does.
Yeah, I mean, the logical extension of what it is that they are doing is that unless they win the election, they think the elections are fraudulent. I mean, that really is kind of an extrapolation of the arguments that they seem to be making, and that really challenges, the tenets of the nation and the system that we say is uniquely American. For our system to work, both parties have to be willing to say, you know what, we lost the election here. We lost. We understand that happens. We're upset about it. We're mad about it. We're going to try to win, in the next cycle. And that's not what the people who are challenging our system now are saying. They're not willing to concede that they could actually have lost an election.
Right. So now I think we've got a sense of the moment that we're in.
We scared everybody now. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, I don't know that we're going to back away from that quite yet. But I want to talk a little bit about what comes next. So, in our, as I said, we track all this legislation, and we saw this wave of legislation like never before last year. We saw all kinds of attacks like we haven't seen before last year. But in our most recent roundup of what's happening in the states, we give a number of reasons for why we expect it to continue in 2022, right? We've already seen lots of bills being pre-filed or carried over from last year in state legislatures. We continue to hear the big lie and see it driving political forces. And so I'm wondering if these trends do continue, as they look like they will, what do you think that means for the state of our democracy down the road in 5 years or in 10 years?
Yeah, I'm real concerned about what our democracy is going to look like 5-10 years down the road. I mean, we not only have these bills that have been introduced and that will be introduced in 2022. The Brennan Center has done a great job in tracking those and raising them up so that the American people have a sense of what's going on in our state legislatures. We also have people running for office now, in these critical positions, secretaries of state, attorneys general, and at lower levels, people in local election boards, people who have said that they believe in this idea, this lie, that somehow the election was stolen in 2020. So you couple these people who could win these elections with these bills that could be passed, and we could have in place a system that is not as resilient, that is not as committed to the rule of the people. And if you're presented with an election like we had in 2020, either at the presidential level or I think you need to understand at the gubernatorial level, at the federal Senate level, with regard to state legislative elections, you could have an infrastructure in place that would not stand for democracy, would not stand for a fair count. Now, I'm cautiously optimistic that we will not go down that path, that somehow, some way we'll work ourselves out of it. But that'll be determined by what it is that we do now. And I'd say over the course of the next, 12 to 18 months. I mean, I think that's about the time period that we've got to try to get this right, to try to make it right, so that our future is consistent with the notions that we have about the American democracy.
So you talked about this new trend of election denialists running to run our elections, and the Brennan Center is also sort of tracking the money going to those races. There's focus on that part of our electoral system in a way that maybe there hasn't been in the past. At the same time as we are seeing attempts of partisan manipulation of election administration, and you mentioned before that you're worried about how all of this how it undermines the idea of a government that is responsive to the will of the people, that is responsive to what the majority's vision for our country is. I'm wondering if we can talk for a second about what that means for how we deal with the moment that we're in other ways, because we are not only at a crucial moment for our democracy, but in the way that our elections work. But I think we've also in the last few years seen that we're in a critical moment when it comes to grappling with major demographic shifts in our country, when it comes to grappling with our nation's ever ongoing struggle against racial injustice. And I wonder if you can talk for a second about how you think these two things relate to one another. If we continue heading down this path with regard to how our democracy functions, what will that mean with how we're able to grapple with these issues and these changes that we're facing right now?
Yeah, we're in the midst of demographic changes, the likes of which this nation has never seen before. At one point, we said we were going to be have a greater number of people of color than white folks in 2050. I think that's now been moved up to 2043. This increasing diversity that we see in the nation can be a source of great strength, or it can be a source of great division. And this is all of these things are mixed up. It's a question again of who will have power. Is it simply going to be we will count the votes irrespective of who casts them, or are we going to make it more difficult for this new emerging majority to actually be able to express itself politically? That is kind of up in the air, but you can't divorce these demographic changes from this fight for political power retention. After a while, it almost becomes, and I think it has become, tribal, where people will do things that, if you look objectively, are against their self-interest, but allows them to retain power. And that is something that I think we've not necessarily seen to the degree that we're now experiencing. But I think we are naive. We're really naive, and we're dangerously naive to try to divorce racial things, ethnic things from this political fight that we are having. This is not a pure political fight. This political fight is infused with racial and ethnic concerns.
I think that there was a lot of reporting about some of the strains of political activity that were at the forefront of the attacks that we saw on our Capitol last year on January 6th that also sort of illustrate the way that that this tribal mentality and this idea of how demographic shifts might lead to certain groups losing power ties directly into the attacks that we're seeing on our democracy right now. You said I think you said 12 to 18 months are going to be crucial in determining where we head. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what do we need to do in the next 12 to 18 months? What is the answer to this problem that you've laid out? How can we effectively address what we've made clear is a scary moment? What is it that needs to happen?
Well, I think it requires a degree of civic engagement that is not typical, that is not normal for so-called ordinary American citizens. I think, what happens in 2022 with regard to the elections, both at the state and federal level, will be, extremely important. So people need to vote. Whatever the barriers are that are placed in front of us, we need to make sure that we really vote, and then beyond election day that we stay engaged. We've got to push back against the redistricting, the inappropriate redistricting, the gerrymandering efforts that are going on now. It's something that I've really been involved in since 2017. We still have about half the states or so that are going to have to complete their redistricting process. That is something that I think that we need to focus on. But I really do think we tend to underestimate the power that we have as I said, as so-called ordinary citizens. If the American people are galvanized, if the American people are active, if the American people are focused, if the American people demand transparency and demand to be involved, we can have an impact on the course of our democracy and the direction that our democracy will take. It won't be easy. People tend to get enthused immediately before an election and then lose interest in things political immediately after election. We don't have that luxury now. We can't allow, you talk about a steal, we can't allow people to steal our democracy from us. My hope would be that this be something that would be, bipartisan in nature, that, good thinking Republicans and good thinking Democrats, good thinking independents could, somehow, work together to sustain our system, to repair our system. And I guess I'm, maybe naively, cautiously optimistic that is possible. But it's really going to be important for people in leadership positions to stand up for our democracy, to call out those people who are in those institutions that are engaging in anti-democratic activities. So I think this is something that can be done, but it's really going to involve individuals getting involved in a way that we don't typically do. This is a crisis. And Americans respond pretty well to crises, and so making the American people understand that this is a crisis that we have to confront. Maybe that will be something that will engage people in the way that I think is going to be necessary.
Yeah. So you mentioned people need to speak up. They need to turn out and vote, but they also need to engage beyond just showing up to vote, right? That there's a level of civic engagement that's required. I do think, one sign of the fact that that's happening, I as a voting rights lawyer, I feel like the world around me cares about what I'm doing right now more than probably it has for some time. This is an issue that's rising up. And I think one way you see that manifest is in the fact that Congress, as the number one bill in both the House and the Senate that was introduced in this Congress were bills addressing our democracy, and right now, and acknowledging that the audience is viewing this a few days after we're having this conversation, but right now we are witnessing a fight in Congress over exactly these issues. That this is in the center of the political conversation. And I think that, and Congress is, and what I mean is Congress is considering the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act right now. I think that it has moved to the center because politicians are responsive to their constituencies. They hear what the voters want. And they know that voting rights has become an issue this is the thing that state legislatures are doing also because they're responsive to constituents. It's happening on the restrictive side of things, and state legislatures are passing laws to restrict access to voting. But it's also happening on the expansive side of things like we've never seen before. There are state legislatures that are expanding access to voting in many states, which has now led us to this moment where we sort of see divergent trends, and what access you have to the ballot box depends on where you live more and more. But Congress does have the opportunity to set that national standard and to keep that from being these diverging trends. So I wonder at this moment, which is a precarious one, what's happening day to day in Congress. We have our ups and our downs, and it's not clear where we're headed. And And I don't think it will necessarily be clear where we're headed when everyone is watching this conversation. But just to follow up on what you said about how people need to be engaged civically, what is it that it will take for that kind of national action at the congressional level? And if it can't get done at the congressional level, are there other methods? Are there other forms of advocacy? Are there other things that your typical citizen can do that might get us to the outcome that you're looking for in the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, I want to emphasize the fact civic engagement, ordinary American citizen engagement is a powerful thing. If you remember the Women's March after the Trump election in 2016, that was a powerful expression by the women of this nation, and it reverberated. It had an impact on policy. It had an influence on the desire of the Trump government and the Trump administration. They were not, in the Republicans in Congress, they didn't do as much as they wanted to do. The mobilization by Indivisible and other organizations around the whole question, the whole healthcare, the repeal of Obamacare, that didn't happen. John McCain did the famous thumbs down, and that was, that's kind of an iconic moment. But other Republicans didn't vote the way in which their party would have expected them to vote because of, again, pressure from American citizens, because they were engaged around that issue. Those are just two examples of the way in which regular Americans can have an influence on policy. With regard to the thing that I have been focused on, fighting gerrymandering, having a fair redistricting process, we've been getting citizens to come to hearings where maps are being considered. And when you turn people out to look at legislators actually being engaged in the line drawing process, what we have found is there's a direct connection between maps that are more fair and citizen participation in the process. And so that's why I really think that we need to understand at a really fundamental level that we still have the capacity, that we still have the power to influence the system. Most directly by by the votes that we cast, our participation in the political system, but also in what I would call the civic system. It's something that we have to find a way to be engaged in.
I'm hoping maybe we can end the conversation with, despite all of the crisis talk, about what a more optimistic view of the future might be if we're able to make those changes that you've been talking about, right? Like, let's say Congress passes the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, and we once again have a strong Voting Rights Act that protects against race discrimination. We have a national standard for how elections should function, who can vote, how they can vote, that their votes will count. There was just a victory in Ohio for fair maps. This law in Congress would also handle partisan gerrymandering and lead to a fair redistricting process. If we're able to accomplish all of that, then what do you think the next 5-10 years hold? Then what do you think that will mean for what our democracy looks like and how we're able to handle the moment that we're in?
Yeah, again, I'm this person, this cautiously optimistic person, but I don't think that my cautious optimism is not a realistic view. And
not delusional optimism.
It's not delusional. And I say that because I look at our history. These seem like really dark times. Well, it seemed dark to women who wanted the right to vote, who fought for the right to vote, and who in that struggle undoubtedly thought this was never going to happen. It undoubtedly seemed to be a dark time to Dr. King, to John Lewis, in the midst of the civil rights movement, where they didn't think they were going to be able to, in essence, end an American apartheid system. Must have seemed like impossible to think about the possibility of same-sex marriage. And yet here we are. Women have the right to vote. We had a successful civil rights movement that really fundamentally changed the nation. Same-sex marriage is now essentially the law of the land. So yeah, we've had dark moments. but we have had people who have been able to push through those dark moments and get us to a good place, a successful place. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. And I think that that's true, but that arc only bends when people like ourselves put our hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And that's what the question we have to ask ourselves. What is it that we can do as individuals to put our hands on that arc and pull it towards justice? If we answer that question in the affirmative, that there are things that we can do, and then engage in those activities, and be honest with ourselves. Be honest with ourselves. Have I actually done enough to put my hand on that arc and pull that arc towards justice? And if you can answer that in the affirmative, truthfully, we'll be okay. We'll be okay. Our history, I think, gives me that belief that through dark times we get to better places. We shouldn't be cowed by the uncertainties of the future. We should embrace those uncertainties. That's how we made, the 20th century an American century. I think we can make the 21st an American century as well. If we're not afraid of the future, if we're determined to master it in a way that's consistent with, our founding documents, consistent with, what we say to be American ideals, I think we can do this, but it's going to involve individual effort, individual responsibility, individual engagement.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like we ended on a better note than we started on, and left us all with a good message for how we can be optimistic by doing what we need to do in order to get to that optimistic future. So, thank you so much for taking this time to talk with me, and I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Right, great talking to you, Sean, and I really appreciate all the great work that you're doing at the Brennan Center. Critical. You are the foundation for that cautious optimism that I have. Keep up the great work.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.